Hi, it's Jeff here from VIP Vision. In this video, we're going to be taking a quick look at the VIP Vision SWA series of Power over Ethernet networking switches. Now there's 3 switches in this range, an 8-port, a 16-port and a 24-port. This video is focusing specifically on the 24 and 16-port versions. Now, where would I use a Power over Ethernet networking switch? Well, typically in the CCTV or surveillance industries, we want to use it to connect any IP camera which is not being connected directly to our network video recorder. So usually this happens in sort of larger scenarios where we're exceeding 16 cameras, so we need to connect these all to a Power over Ethernet switch, which then connects into the NVR. However, there are also other situations where it's not possible or not feasible to run all of the cameras back to our network video recorder. So if we had all of, maybe we only had one, we wanted to situate the NVR in a particular location and we only had one Cat5 or Cat6 cable running to that location back from another central communications room or something like that, we can run all of the cameras into the Power over Ethernet switch, and then we can connect that into our network video recorder with just one Cat5 or Cat6 cable going up to 100 meters. Now, in saying that, this product is 802.3AT and 802.3AF compliant. Now these are Power over Ethernet networking standards. So essentially they supply 48 volts out of their ports, and they can be used for anything that supports 802.3AF or AT. So this is not necessarily, obviously, VIP Vision cameras, any other surveillance cameras which support, any other IP cameras which support these standards. You can also use any, for instance, voice over IP phones that support 802.3AT or AF. Another one that's quite common is wireless networking equipment, so wireless access points. They often support those standards. So any of those products can be used using one of these Power over Ethernet switches. Now, being Power over Ethernet, the big advantage here is that we don't have to run cables, any other cables, power cables. We only have to run the Cat5 or Cat6 cable, which supplies both data and power. Now, we'll just take a quick look at these switches now up close. So I'll just switch across to another camera. Okay, so we'll just take a look at we'll start at the side or the front of these switches, side of these switches here. So if we go here, we start at the side. We've got a high quality sun-on ventilation fan in the front here. If we move around to the back of the units, you'll see another ventilation fan here on the power supplies. And we've got our power input jack on the back here as well, a power switch on the unit here as well, so we can switch that on and off. If we flip back around to the front of the unit here. So this is obviously the business end of the unit. So we have our network indication switches or network indication lights here. It'll tell us what's plugged in and what's currently active. Now, if you look a bit further across here, we actually also have some indicators here for power. Now, this will tell us how much power is currently being utilized on the switch. It's probably a little difficult to see there, but we've got 50%, 80%, and 100%. So this will tell us how much free power we have on the switch. Now, that's important. That's important because certain devices draw more power than other devices. So if you had maybe, for instance, a pan-tilt zoom PTZ camera plugged in here, that may be consuming a large chunk of the power that the network switch is able to provide. So this just gives you a quick indication without having to check anything through the web interface of the switch or anything like that. In that note, it is worth noting that these switches are actually managed switches, so we do have web interfaces that we can log into and check, and I'll show you that in a moment. So just going over the switches a bit further here, so if we look down a little bit further here, you'll see we have our console port here. That's just for debugging, you don't have to worry about that. Here we actually have our 1000 base X connectors. Now, what that means is we can insert a fiber adapter in it, such as this one here. So we can insert either a multi-mode or single-mode fiber adapter there, and obviously that would then connect to your fiber like this one here is currently connected now. You would use fiber in situations where you've got long runs, so runs exceeding 100 meters, and yeah, that's what that port there is for. You can also, if you need to, or in certain situations, add Ethernet on here. Keep in mind that these ports are actually shared with the next 2 ports that I'm going to show you. So we have our, like I said, our 1000 base X ports, and then we also have our uplink ports here, which are 1000 base T. So I'm saying these are gigabit ports, okay, so 1000 base T ports, twisted pair ports, and these ones back over here are gigabit, well, anything ports, but in this case, fiber ports is typically what you're going to use them for. So, moving down the line here, now, the next ports in our list, all these grouped ports here, are our camera ports. So as you'll see, our 16 port unit has 16, our 16 channel unit has 16, and our 24 port device has 24. Now, all of these ports are capable of 802.3 or 802.3 AT or AF compliance, so they can source up to 30 watts per port. Now, there are a couple of actual special ports on here. So if you look across here, you can actually see these ones in orange. Now, these ones here actually support high PoE. And when I say high PoE, what I actually mean is they can source up to 60 watts per port. Now, that's important if you have, for instance, a very large PTZ camera, pan-tilt zoom camera. So, for instance, the VIP Vision 2 megapixel laser PTZ camera, ones that draw quite a bit of power, which you can't normally provide power to them, enough power to them via a normal power over Ethernet port such as these ones here. In the past, you would have had to use an additional power supply, but with these switches, you can actually connect them directly, and that's all that you have to worry about. So moving along now, we'll just spin these switches around so that you can see the other side. So this is just the vent holes on the other side of the unit. Yeah, and you'll see that they're identical, and the model numbers here on the model number stickers. Okay, so that's a basic rundown of what's on the switches. Like I said, 16 port, 24 port, they're virtually identical. The only difference is the ports, obviously the number of ports on the devices. So in the box, supplied with the units. I'll just flip back to the other camera now. So we have our rack mount wings supplied with the units. So these units are rack mountable when using these wings that are supplied with the units. Obviously screws and things supplied as well. User manual. Obviously, if you're not using the managed functions of the switch, you probably don't need to worry too much about this, but I'll go through that in a second. And just the power cable, our IEC to our GPIO 3-pin plug. So, as I mentioned, these switches are managed. Now, most people don't use, well, most people in the security industry don't seem to use managed functions. So, when I say managed functions, these devices are, for lack of a better word, smart. They can control how much power is output to certain ports for power over Ethernet, for instance. We can control what's plugged into certain ports. We can turn devices on and off at certain times, things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to plug in, so I've just connected the switch to power. So now I'm just going to plug into Ethernet port here. So it's connecting my laptop, and just this demonstration I'm going to connect using two network cameras. So a panoramic camera and just a standard bullet camera. So I'm just connecting these to any switch ports here, just to show you the management function. So these two devices are now powered up. You can actually see, if you take a quick look at the indicators here, you can see that we now have the two ports lit up. It's indicating that it's supplying power and that we have a link to these devices. And if you look a bit further across here, you can actually see that the 50% light is currently illuminated. Now this means that it's drawing less than 50% of the power that the switch is capable of sourcing. Okay, so now let's just jump across to the web interface. So let's take a look at configuration. So these network switches are configured completely via the web interface. So the default IP address is 192.168.1.110. So keep in mind that you're going to have to, after you've connected it to your laptop, you're going to then have to configure your IP address to be within the same range so that you can contact the switch. So I've entered that IP. Now I need to log in. Default username and password is admin and admin. Now it's going to force me to change this the first time I log in, so I'm just going to change it to 6 ones for the sake of this video, but please use strong passwords. Going to ignore that. Now, the first thing you're met with once you log in is the panel status graph. So this actually shows us information about the switch. It's just a really basic overview of what's plugged in, what's currently connected. You can see that we've got a fiber device plugged in, which is, or it's not currently connected to copper, so it defaults to fiber. And then you can see what we've currently got up, what devices are up, what our link speeds are. So you can see this is currently connected at 1 gigabit, and these ones are connected at 100 megabit. So it's worth noting that on these switches, there's actually all of the Power over Ethernet ports are 100 megabit ports, and the uplink ports are gigabit ports, which is usually fine for any device like a camera, IP cameras, and certain IP phones and things like that, but may be an issue for wireless devices or wireless access points and things if you're going down that path. So just be aware of that. Now, I'm just going to quickly skim through system info here just to show you some information about this device or some of the more useful things that you can change. So system info just gives you basic information about network configuration. This is where we change our IP address that we entered before. Software update, don't worry about that. Password change, this is where we're going to change our password after we've changed it for the first time. Restore default as if we wanted to default the device. System reboot, that one's obvious, we're going to reboot the device from there. This will give us our log information. Currently nothing stored in the log. Now, port management. This is where it starts becoming a little more interesting. So, port configuration. This is where we set up whether we've got our ports turned on or turned off, and what speed we want to set them to. We can name the ports so that it can be helpful down the track as to what's plugged into what if you're accessing this remotely. Now, this is useful if you want to disable certain ports, unused ports on the device, so that no one else can plug anything additional in. So that's a good feature. Port mirroring is used if you want to do any debugging on a device. It basically sends everything that hits one network port to another network port. Just Google port mirroring if you're interested in that. Port statistics, so this will tell us information about what we've got plugged in, how many packets have been sent while this page has been open. So you can see this down here, port 26, which is the one that I'm connected to with my laptop, is currently sending packets, and we're getting notifications of that. You can also come in here and select collision count, dropped packets, CRC errors, things like that, just informational stuff for debugging. Port speed limits. Now, this is if we wanted to set up, I suppose, quality of service on each port. So if we want to restrict ports on these devices from pulling too much data, we can do that. Usually it's not something that you're going to care about in the surveillance industry or even IP phones and things like that, but it is there if you want it. Broadcast storm control is used to prevent people from messing things up by plugging one port into another port via a short network cable or causing loopback issues. Don't worry too much about that one. Long distance. Now this is really the first one that we need to talk about. So these devices are actually capable of extending the range. If you're using a capable product, so as a VIP Vision IP camera for instance, this unit, this network switch, will actually allow you to, over a long run, exceed the 100-meter threshold that is usually what we consider for Ethernet. Now, it does that by reducing the Ethernet speed from 100 megabit down to 10 megabit. Okay, so when we do that, we can actually stretch the distance out from 100 meters to 250 meters. Now, this can be very useful in certain situations. So if you've got a camera that's a really long way away, let's say you've got a gatehouse or something like that, you don't want to put in any wireless gear, you don't want to have to run fiber. This gives you that little bit of extra distance. So if it's 150 meters away, 200 meters away, you've got one single camera, you can do this. Keep in mind that this is it's not a good idea to run, I suppose, big cameras. So if you had maybe, say, an 8 megapixel PTZ or something that you wanted to run really high data rates through, this is not something that you're going to want to do. However, for basic camera situations, so if I've got something like a bullet camera that I want to run, a 4 megapixel bullet camera, and I need to connect that, then that's worthwhile. Now, as I said, it does that by reducing the bandwidth. Never use this for an uplink thing. So if you need to link switches together, don't use this feature. But it is really good for linking cameras that are quite a distance away. It can sometimes come in handy when you're trying to compensate for a bad cable. So if, for instance, you've got missing pairs in a cable, or you've got really bad crosstalk for some reason, you've got a buried cable, you can't do anything about it, this can sometimes fix that. But keep in mind, it extends distance by reducing speed, so there's a trade-off there. Now, so that's long distance. Now to enable that, I can either enable all the ports or I can just enable the ports that I want to enable. So that will extend us out up to 250 meters. Okay, so the next thing in this list, spanning tree, don't worry about that. Google it if you want to know. VLANs. VLANs are something that are probably not used in the security industry as much as they probably should be. So VLANs allow you to set up virtual networks between ports on the devices. So if, for instance, we wanted to have two completely separate networks on this switch, so we wanted to divide it up and say, oh, you know, I want ports 1, 6, 7, and 9 all to be one network, and the rest of the ports to be a completely different network, or virtual networks. We can do that through here. So that would, what it does is, in a technical term, is it restricts the broadcast domains of these LANs, broadcast domains, and all other packets as well, I suppose. There's certain situations where you use VLANs. Strongly suggest that you Google them to find out more information. It's something that people should probably be looking into more. It's very good from a security point of view in the sense that you can divide things up. You can prevent certain things from accessing other things. Like, for instance, if we only had one port on a network video recorder and we wanted to allow a network video recorder to access our cameras, but we did not want to allow our staff PCs, which are also connected to that same network switch, trying to access that video recorder, we didn't want them to be able to access the cameras directly. We could do that using VLANs. So that's just something to keep in mind. Not used very often, but good to have. So you would configure that through here. You can set up which VLANs certain ports are members to, and you do that in here. Link aggregation is used if we wanted to use multiple ports to pull more than, or we wanted to use them for redundancy, or we wanted to use them for, increasing speeds, things like that. I wouldn't worry too much about that. QoS settings, so this is quality of service. This can sometimes be useful when we're talking about trying to reduce latency on cameras and things. If you're starting to head towards the limitations of the switch, I would suggest that you probably won't need to use this in most scenarios. Security, now this is useful, okay? So what a lot of people don't really realize is when they go ahead and they run an IP camera outside, particularly outside, but it could be inside a building, they're essentially they're running this Ethernet cable out to that point as well. Now, what most people don't realize in that situation is, hey, if someone rocks up with a laptop, plugs an Ethernet cable, plugs into that Ethernet cable, unless you're controlling your ports on the back of through a network switch, I can immediately get access to everything that camera had access to. Okay, so in most situations, that's going to be my network video recorder. Now, if you've set up passwords and things correctly, this may not be as much of an issue, but it's certainly a good idea to restrict what can be connected to this port of this network switch. Now, that's where our port security comes in. So what we can do is we can bind each port to a certain MAC address. Now, the MAC address is the address of the camera, the physical address of the camera, and we can say, hey, anything without this MAC address, we want to disallow from ever actually being able to connect to the device or having any access at all. So we bind a MAC address to a port. That's one way of doing it. So we could say, oh, port 2 always must have, XYZ MAC address, and anytime that's wrong, refuse access to that port. Or we can just say from a switch point of view, we can say only allow MAC addresses which are in the list X through Z. Now, so that comes in handy because if you've got MAC binding set up and for some reason you switch ports 2 and ports 4 around, neither of your cameras is going to work. Whereas if you set up MAC filtering, that allows us to, again, just put in a list, and if we have X, Y, and Z in here, X, Y, and Z MAC addresses in here, and we happen to plug them into ports 2, 4, and 6, and then one day, we come in to service the recorder or service something, and we, unplug ports 4 and 6 and get them mixed around, it's still not going to be a problem, and your security is still there. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's a very good feature to have. SNMP stands for Simple Network Monitoring Protocol. If you need to use that, you'll know what that is. Google it. 802.1x. Now this is not something that you're going to care too much about, I don't think, in most situations. So this is all just to do with authentication. You can see you can set up a radius server here. Don't worry too much about that. IGMP snooping, just leave that alone, not a problem. Okay, now PoE settings. So this is the section that's going to be very useful to us in general when we're plugging in cameras and things like that, or any other device. So this gives us a live statistic, I suppose, on how much power is currently being consumed through the switch and how much power we have remaining in our reserves. Now it also lets us adjust our maximum power output from the switch. Now these switches are all capable, or both capable, of 240 watts, up to 240 watts. However, you can restrict your power output, and it is by default restricted to be less than that number. So that's our total down here. Now, like I said, you can see our consumed and our remaining. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to plug in another camera. So this camera I had unplugged before, so I'm just going to plug that in. And now we're going to switch back over. Now, as this camera powers up, you will see that this number will increase. There you go. So it's gone up to 16 watts now that this camera is connected. So you'll see that it'll float somewhere around about there. Now, if the infrared on this camera were to be turned on as well, you will see it go up again. So this just gives you, like I said, just gives you a basic indication of how much power is currently being drawn from the switch. And now infrared is on. And you can see we're heading up. It jumps around a little bit depending on what your cameras and things like that are doing, but it's really just there to give you a basic indication of what, how much power we're currently drawing. So PoE event statistics is the other thing here. So this tells you it basically just tells you information about the cameras. So if there's something going wrong with regards to the camera, maybe a cable shorted, it's lost power for some reason, or it's shorted somewhere, or the port's gone into thermal shutdown, this will tell you why. Now the final thing on the list here is green PoE. So green PoE, it's really just a euphemism for being able to turn ports on and off at certain times. So while this is not a particularly good thing for a camera to do, maybe if you're using IP phones and you want to turn all of the IP phones off in the building at, on the weekend because no one's there, this can be a good thing to do. So we can set time zones, time schedules, and which ports we want to turn on and off. And that's it. So basically we just come in here, select it, set our time zone up here, and then that port's going to turn on and off at that particular time. So there you have it. So in this video, we've introduced our VIP Vision SWA series, the 24 and 16 port network switches, Power over Ethernet network switches, and some of their features through the web interface, and obviously what our physical features, the ports on the front and things like that. If you have any further questions regarding this product, please feel free to leave a comment below. If you've got any questions on anything else or another video that you'd like to see, please leave comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you like what you see, and yeah, thanks for watching.